We'll end our survey of ancient Chinese history with the very famous Maritime Voyages of Zheng He. This occurred during the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty was founded in 1368 and lasted until 1644. And it's actually one of the rare dynasties that begins in the south, in the Yangtze River Delta. The first emperor, Zhu Yanzhang, founds the imperial capital originally in Nanjing, which literally means southern capital, before it's later going to be moved up north to Beijing. And that's actually part of the story of the expeditions of Zheng He as well. But as many people have heard about, even if you have very little familiarity with Chinese history, Zheng He, well, eventually there's 7 expeditions total. I believe Zheng He undertakes the first 6 of these. 7 expeditions during the early 15th century to very distant lands, Southeast Asia, South Asia, some ports in the Middle East, and then even eventually towards the last expeditions, the eastern coast of Africa. These are extraordinary, and they demand explanation. So we're going to use the expeditions of Zheng He fairly late in Chinese history, the 15th century, to again, like the civil service examination, to open up some windows onto some broader themes. We don't want to tackle Chinese history and just dynasty, what happened, major events, that sort of stuff. We want to understand major changes and themes. So the expeditions of Zheng He are a great way to do that. So let's start off with a related question, although you might not realize it's related at the outset. What did the expansion of Chinese dynasties look like? In what direction did they gaze when they were incorporating new lands and new people into their empire? Well, territorial conquest by those northern hybrid states, the ones that, Tang Dynasty, Yuan Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, the ones that kind of look Chinese on the surface because we refer to them by their Chinese character. But if you scratch beyond the surface, you realize, whoa, there's a great deal of Turks in the Tang Dynasty, a great deal of Mongols in the Yuan Dynasty, and a large dose of Manchus and Mongols in the Qing Dynasty who actually hold preeminent power, and the Chinese are junior partners in this imperial project. Well, those northern hybrid states, which are always the largest and most powerful of the empires in Chinese history, they almost always look towards land. All right, they always look towards land, specifically towards Inner Asia, what is today Manchuria, Mongolia, Xinjiang, Central Asia, and even Tibet. And this was actually expressed, the strategic calculus of this was expressed most eloquently in the late 19th century by sort of a domino theory. The idea that Beijing, the northern capital, which is strategically situated about halfway between the northern zone nomads, that's the source of military and political power, and the wealthy sedentary agricultural lands of the Yangtze River and further south of that. That capital, oftentimes Beijing, especially in the late imperial era, situated perfectly. How do you protect Beijing? Well, that's the domino theory. Most threats prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to European steam-propelled engines and ships coming over in modern warships to destroy Qing Dynasty armies, most threats, all threats we might say, came not from the sea. All right, from the sea were meddlesome, pesky pirates, Japanese pirates and whatnot, but usually not a threat, political threat to the dynasty. Those threats came overland, almost always from Central Asia or Inner Asia. Nomads, if you are a sedentary Chinese ruler, or other nomads who you compete with if you are already a nomad yourself. So they always were looking to expand into Central Asia, tame the nomads, neutralize the nomadic threat in Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Manchuria. All right, so most expansion will be in that direction. However, many of the states also pushed south. Oftentimes, this was a process of migration, gradual migration by wealthier people, dense communities that would gradually displace other people, often Austronesian speakers who already lived in the south and are going to be increasingly pushed off or integrated with Chinese cultural communities. Many of the southern agricultural states, such as the Song Dynasty, such as the Ming Dynasty, would increase their migration and sometimes military force overland into the southwest, into areas that are culturally more closely related to Southeast Asia than they are to China. The modern-day provinces of Yunnan, Guangxi, sometimes they go into Vietnam as well. During the Ming Dynasty, Vietnam will temporarily, for a very brief period, be formally incorporated as a province of the Ming Empire. Generally speaking, the people in the south and southwest overland were seen as culturally inferior to the Chinese and thus suitable for assimilation. When they encounter peoples who seem to have their own literary culture and long historical traditions like the Muslims, they usually weren't seen as culturally inferior, and usually then they were not targets for Chinese assimilation. They would say, okay, you've got your separate civilization, we've got ours, we can both sort of be subsumed under the same civilized category, but with distinct identities. Now, China also occasionally looks south toward the sea. Not often, at least not for political ventures. There were always merchants and fishermen, Chinese junks who would ply a trade between southern China and Southeast Asia, both island Southeast Asia, what is today Indonesia, and peninsular continental East Asia, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. And that was more of an economic network, but usually the capital far in the north, such as Beijing, didn't pay that much attention to these economic relationships in the south. However, this did change during the early Ming Dynasty with the rise of Emperor Yongle in the late 14th, early 15th century. Yongle is the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty. His father founded the dynasty and then gave the succession to his grandson, Yongle's nephew. Yongle was very upset about this. He usurped the throne, declared war on his nephew, and then moved the capital from Nanjing to Beijing. He was already posted to Beijing, and he thought that the dynasty needed to keep a closer eye on the Mongol threat. He then went to Beijing, created the imperial capital, commissioned the construction of the Forbidden City. Yongle is responsible for the construction of the Forbidden City, and then sent out successive treasure fleets, as they were known in Chinese, to the South Seas beginning in the year 1405. These are the Zheng He expeditions. Right, the captain was a eunuch named Zheng He, who was originally of Central Asian and Muslim background, whose family, I believe, was captured during the Mongol conquest of Yunnan, and they themselves were Muslims who came from Central Asia. So you see portraits of Zheng He that show him as looking very East Asian Chinese. You should take those with a grain of salt. Very likely he looked somewhat different. He did, by the time that he was captured as a eunuch and reared in the imperial court and was a trusted eunuch advisor of the Yongle emperor, he had already long converted to Buddhism by this point, but his ancestry is very unique. He was entrusted with the sort of mission that was typically given by emperors to eunuchs. If you're in a southern dynasty, which the Ming Dynasty was, originated in the south, they often had enormous numbers of eunuchs. The Ming Dynasty is estimated to have something like 20,000 eunuchs in their employ. Or if you were a northern hybrid state, you usually gave these sensitive strategic missions to non-Chinese, non-Han aristocrats who were related to the imperial clan. In the Qing Dynasty, these were known as bannermen in the late imperial era. Why do you have eunuchs and non-Han aristocrats, depending on what kind of state you are? Because the emperor doesn't trust those civil service examination Han families, chiefly from the south, who dominate the imperial bureaucracy. He wants someone who has closer, unmediated loyalty to him. What is the purpose? What is the purpose of the Zheng He expeditions? Well, quite simply, they were to obtain declarations of loyalty and thus political legitimacy for the Yongle emperor's very bloody and illegitimate succession to the throne of the Ming Dynasty. He wanted these declarations from far-flung peoples, as far as the known world could possibly make contact with. He wanted people to be able to say, we recognize the Yongle emperor is the legitimate emperor of the great Ming Dynasty of China. So the known world by this point encompassed maritime voyages that the Mongols had taken in the previous dynasty, the Yuan dynasty. Kublai Khan, in his competition with other descendants of Genghis Khan, eventually found the overland route across Central Asia blocked off by the Chagatai Khanate. So how is he going to keep communications with the Il Khanate in Persia, who was on his side, one of his allies, fighting the other descendants of Genghis Khan? He did that by sea. And he sent multiple voyages to Southeast Asia and South Asia in order to have maritime access to what is Persia, where he had his Mongol allies ruling there. So the Ming knew about this, and they said, wherever our predecessor Mongols had gone, we need to at least be able to equal their achievements. What a great way to renew those ties and gain declarations of loyalty from the known world that the Yongle emperor is the sole legitimate emperor of the Ming Dynasty. All right, it was a mission of power projection to equal the accomplishments of the previous Mongols. The Chinese can't be less than the Mongols, right? And it was also a mission to obtain political legitimacy for a very illegitimate emperor. That's what the Zheng He expeditions were about. Contrary to a certain very popular history book, I have to put scare quotes around history because it's basically pure fiction. All serious historians agree that it's pure fiction. Zheng He didn't discover America in the year 1421. He didn't spark the Italian Renaissance. The Chinese records are very clear. We know exactly where he went. We know exactly what he did. He stopped in ports, maritime ports in Southeast Asia, tried to find people who were in the Mongol Yuan records, have saying, hey, they met these people, they were loyal to the Mongols, let's see if we can find their successor and if they'll be loyal to us. If they were, great. We exchanged gifts with them, we engaged in trade, we bestowed a medal upon our preferred local chief. If not, if they were belligerent, if they said, no, we don't recognize you, then they often went to war. Zheng He got off the boat and fought them. There was a famous one in Sri Lanka where the local Sri Lankan ruler did not do as Zheng He wanted him to do. So Zheng He went inland with an army and tried to kill him and was almost killed himself. This often gets written out of the narratives of Zheng He. Not only was it not a voyage of discovery, it wasn't. It also was not, as the Chinese government today likes to characterize it, in an analogy to its own so-called peaceful rise on the world stage. It wasn't a mission of peace. He wasn't an ambassador of peace who had an alternative way of power projection that different than the bloodthirsty Europeans would do in the coming century. All right, he was trying to obtain declarations of loyalty for the Yongle emperor, and he would resort to military force if necessary. If you cooperated with him, you'd benefit economically and symbolically in saying, hey, the Chinese emperor favors me. The voyages stopped in the 1430s. Once the Yongle emperor was dead, and his successors realized just how wasteful this project of imperial legitimization and power projection was, and how unnecessary it was now that the emperor was dead, and we don't need to defend his legitimacy anymore. He won the succession, so why are we still doing this? Confucian scholars also criticized the excess, and they rightly said, we have no need of this. China is wealthy, expansive, we have everything we need. Inner Asia overland is the real threat. We need to worry about the Mongols. Now, there's some exaggeration to this. China is not this closed-off hermit kingdom, self-sufficient. It always had links with the outside world. It always had trade links, political links. But generally speaking, yeah, China was the center of gravity for the culture, the economy, the politics of all of East Asia. And these journeys were totally unnecessary. Right? They did, however, show that China did regularly engage distant worlds, and they also showcased the tremendous wealth and resources that was available to a dynasty, even a southern agricultural dynasty that did not incorporate the northern zone nomads. That's what the Ming dynasty was. Just think of the tremendous wealth and resources for all these ships. Tens of thousands of people, enormous ships. The dimensions of the ships have been exaggerated. Recent scholarship has shown they couldn't possibly be as big as they are actually said to have been. The sheer physics of it would not allow a ship like that to be seaworthy, but nevertheless, they were large. And a lot of money was put into this over many decades. All right, that is a great symbol of the prosperity, the sophistication of the Chinese empire. And this happened to take place during the Ming Dynasty, but it's also the same resources that were available to the Qing Dynasty afterwards, which was largely northern zone nomads, Manchus and Mongols working in concert with northern Han to conquer the region. All right, and they were capable of doing long-distance navigation a century before the Europeans started to match the same sort of distances. So to rephrase that very popular book that I'm not going to name, China could have discovered America. Well, not discovered, it was already inhabited, you know what I mean. They could have been the first non-Native Americans to encounter America and try to settle it if they wanted to, but they didn't want to, or really need to. When the British ambassador George Macartney visited the Qianlong Emperor in 1793, a very famous meeting in Chinese history, really on the end of our timeline here, we're going to finish with this, he wanted to get permission to have a permanent English ambassador stationed at Beijing to look after British commercial interests in the Qing dynasty. And the Qianlong Emperor had a very grandiose and arrogant response that he wrote down. It's become very famous, in which he basically says, we have no need of anything that your country manufactures. We're self-sufficient, we're powerful, and you should be trembling before my majesty when you come to visit Beijing. We're not going to accede to your demands. This is the way things are done. We are the only big game in town. People accommodate what we say the rules are going to be. This will later be criticized so heavily by Western scholars, Chinese scholars. Oh, look at the hubris, look at the arrogance. So clearly we can see China's about to have a great fall. A lot of that was bluster. A lot of that was rhetorical bluster that monarchs in that day and age always sort of used. China was not entirely self-sufficient. It did engage other parts. He was aware of the usefulness of British and European manufacturers and whatnot. But nevertheless, it does encapsulate a fairly important point. China, compared to Europe at least, was far more self-sufficient, even if not 100% self-sufficient. It was far more self-sufficient, far wealthier, and really didn't have any need of trying to go out and find new lands, new colonies, new resources. The Europeans were desperate. They were blocked off by the Ottoman Empire, more powerful than them. They had to go out and try to find a way to get to the East Indies and the spices. And that's how they bumped into America. And then diseases killed off 90% of the population. Very fortunate for the Europeans. Suddenly you have an open land whose resources you can exploit. And then the Industrial Revolution occurs. And then suddenly the Europeans have unprecedented power. But a lot of that was an accident. And China's going to suffer because of this. But on the eve of the modern era, the Zheng He expeditions illustrate a very important point. That China had no need of going out and discovering America. All right? These were wasteful expeditions. There were other concerns back at home, overland, with the Mongols. And later on, when the Europeans do come, they will be able to take advantage of this self-sufficiency. It's sort of a perverse irony that the Europeans are desperate and poorer than the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese, and that leads them to venture out on risky expeditions, and lo and behold, they bump into substantial resources there for the taking. And then the more resourceful and successful empires end up suffering as a result because they didn't bump into them. They didn't need to go out and increase the odds that they would bump into something like that. And I think that's the takeaway message that I'd like to end on a course on ancient Chinese history. Very different. On the eve of the modern Chinese history era, we will see a very different dynamic going forth, and it's going to take a long time to dislodge this belief in the self-sufficiency and the preeminence of the Chinese Empire. That's because you have an unbroken, continuous history of 3,000 years that was filled with evolving institutions, change over time, and increasing sophistication of imperial bureaucratic institutions, and the economy, the population of the entire East Asian continental heartland as well. So thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed this course.